The most persistent misunderstanding of Star Wars as political commentary is the belief that it is primarily about individuals, villains, heroes, or the moral failures of particular voters, when in reality its warning is aimed at systems that behave predictably under pressure, systems that do not require malice to drift toward domination, only incentives that reward compliance and punish resistance. And this framing is what allows the story to remain relevant across eras, because it speaks less to who holds power than to how power behaves once fear becomes its primary fuel. Power in this universe expands during crisis not because anyone openly demands tyranny, but because emergencies create permission structures, moments where extraordinary authority feels not only acceptable but responsible. And once those structures exist, they rarely dissolve completely, because relinquishing power requires trust in stability. Something crises are specifically designed to erode. In Star Wars, this expansion is formalized through votes, delegations, and procedural consent, and that process mirrors a broader truth about governance, where authority gained under exceptional circumstances becomes difficult to fully unwind, as each new threat justifies retaining tools that were meant to be temporary, slowly redefining what normal governance looks like without ever announcing the shift. This is where legality begins to replace morality, because once actions are framed as lawful or constitutional, ethical questions are treated as secondary, subjective, or impractical, and systems trained to prioritize procedure over outcome can commit profound harm while remaining internally consistent, convincing participants that responsibility ends where compliance begins. The rise of the Empire demonstrates how devastating this substitution can be, because nothing Palpatine does is illegal by the standards he reshapes, and that technical legitimacy becomes a shield against scrutiny, allowing injustice to advance without triggering alarms, since the mechanisms designed to prevent abuse are satisfied as long as rules are followed, regardless of who wrote them or why. Bureaucracy amplifies this effect by dispersing accountability, transforming decisions into processes and harm into byproducts, because when responsibility is divided across agencies, committees, and offices, no single actor feels answerable for outcomes, and systems can continue inflicting damage long after any individual intent has faded into routine. Star Wars repeatedly emphasizes that the most effective oppression is not driven by passion, but by paperwork, as permits, authorizations, and reports quietly regulate behavior, restrict movement, and normalize surveillance, making control feel procedural rather than coercive, and in doing so reducing the likelihood of moral resistance. Security language becomes the dominant currency in this environment, because words like safety, stability, and order are emotionally persuasive, especially in societies conditioned by trauma. And once those terms define debate, civil liberties are reframed as risks rather than rights, obstacles to protection rather than foundations of freedom. This rhetorical shift is crucial, because it allows extreme measures to be discussed as practical necessities instead of ideological choices, and once fear governs the conversation, moderation feels irresponsible, restraint feels naive, and opposition can be dismissed not as dissent but as danger. Long before freedoms are formally revoked, trust in institutions begins to erode, and Star Wars is precise about this sequencing, showing that legitimacy collapses first, participation declines next, and only then do rights disappear, often with little resistance because the public has already disengaged emotionally from systems they no longer believe will protect them. Citizens stop asking what government ought to be and start asking how to endure it, and this withdrawal creates a vacuum that central authority is all too willing to fill, since disengaged populations are easier to manage than mobilized ones, and silence is far more valuable to power than agreement. This is why the Galactic Empire is not a story about evil voters or corrupted masses, but about institutional momentum, about structures that reward obedience and penalize friction regardless of intent, creating outcomes that feel inevitable, even to those participating in them. Individuals within these systems may believe they are acting responsibly, pragmatically, or even reluctantly, but the system itself does not reward conscience, only efficiency. And over time, this recalibration teaches participants to equate morality with compliance, insulating themselves from the consequences of their actions. Polarization accelerates this process by making compromise feel impossible, because when governance becomes gridlocked, stronger authority starts to look like a solution rather than a threat, and people exhausted by dysfunction become willing to tolerate concentration of power simply to restore functionality. Star Wars captures this dynamic by showing a galaxy that does not embrace authoritarianism enthusiastically, but resigns itself to it, choosing predictability over participation and order over deliberation, because exhaustion can be just as powerful a motivator as fear. What makes this warning so effective is its subtlety. Because nothing breaks all at once, checks and balances still exist on paper, councils still meet, senates still convene. Yet their ability to restrain power has already been hollowed out, leaving behind forms without force and rituals without consequence. The Jedi and the Senate are not abolished when they fail, they are rendered irrelevant. And that irrelevance arrives quietly, without announcement, making it difficult to pinpoint the moment when democracy truly ends. Because it never collapses, it transitions. Democracy in Star Wars does not vanish overnight. It rebrands itself, reframes its language, and redefines its priorities until the change feels natural, even necessary. And by the time the banners change and the titles shift, the transformation has already been accepted, emotionally, if not consciously. This is the core of the warning, that the most dangerous political shifts are not those imposed by force, but those justified by fear, normalized by procedure, and sustained by disengagement. Because once people stop believing they have agency, they stop defending the structures that once protected it. What the second movement clarifies is that Star Wars is not issuing a moral indictment of populations, but a structural warning about how systems behave once incentives tilt toward obedience and away from friction. Because when institutions reward smooth operation over ethical resistance, they will reliably drift towards centralization, regardless of the personal values of those within them. The galactic empire does not emerge because citizens suddenly desire cruelty, but because systems gradually recalibrate what is rewarded and what is punished, teaching participants that compliance is safe and resistance is costly. And once that lesson is internalized, outcomes begin to look intentional, even when they are simply the product of accumulated avoidance. This is why the story places so little emphasis on evil voters or mass enthusiasm, because most people within the galaxy are not animated by hatred or ideology, but by exhaustion, fear, and a desire for normalcy, and systems that promise stability exploit those impulses efficiently, offering relief from chaos at the price of agency. Polarization accelerates this process by collapsing the middle ground, because when compromise feels impossible, governance stalls, and in that paralysis stronger authority starts to appear not as a threat, but as a necessary correction, reframing central power as functionality rather than domination. Star Wars depicts this transition with precision, showing that when deliberation fails, people stop demanding better systems and start demanding faster ones. And speed almost always favours concentration of power, because deliberation is inherently decentralised while command is not. Fear then becomes the accelerant, because once a population is conditioned to expect constant threat, extraordinary measures feel ordinary, and vigilance becomes permanent, creating a psychological environment where emergency powers no longer feel exceptional, but reassuring. This normalization of extremes is one of the saga's most chilling insights, because it demonstrates how quickly boundaries shift when danger is treated as constant, and how easily populations adapt to expanded surveillance, force, and restriction, once those tools are framed as protective rather than intrusive. The failure of checks and balances in this context is almost invisible, because they continue to exist formally. Councils still convene, senates still vote, and legal language still flows. Yet their capacity to restrain power has already been stripped away by precedent, fear, and deference. The Jedi and the Senate are emblematic here, not because they vanish immediately, but because their authority erodes quietly, as their objections are bypassed, delayed, or reframed until their presence becomes symbolic rather than substantive, leaving behind institutions that exist on paper but no longer shape outcomes. This quiet failure is far more dangerous than overt abolition, because it allows people to believe safeguards remain in place long after they have lost effect, delaying resistance and prolonging acceptance, since it is harder to mobilize against erosion than against destruction. Democracy in Star Wars does not end with a dramatic rupture, but with a transition that feels procedural, inevitable, and even responsible, as language shifts from representation to efficiency, from rights to stability, and from participation to order, without ever announcing that a line has been crossed. This rebranding is essential because it allows people to adapt emotionally before they are forced to adapt politically, and by the time freedoms are formally curtailed, the population has already internalized the logic that justifies their removal. What the story ultimately warns is that the most dangerous political transformations are those that feel boring while they are happening, because spectacle invites scrutiny, while administration invites acceptance, and systems that operate quietly are far harder to resist than those that announce themselves loudly. The empire does not rely on constant terror to function, but on predictability, routine, and the gradual narrowing of acceptable behaviour, training citizens to self-regulate long before enforcement is required. And this efficiency is what makes it so durable. In this framework, the loss of freedom is not experienced as a theft, but as a trade, one made incrementally under pressure, where each concession feels rational in isolation, even as the cumulative effect becomes irreversible. Star Wars insists that this is how democratic systems fail most often, not through dramatic overthrow, but through consent shaped by fear, disengagement, and the belief that order and liberty are opposing values rather than interdependent ones. The final warning is not that tyranny will arrive announcing itself as evil, but that it will present itself as necessity, as maturity, as the only remaining option once faith in institutions has been exhausted. And by the time that realization sets in, the transition will already feel complete.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.